Okay, welcome everyone. We are here for the live stream. This is Mastering Process Design to Drive Business Growth. I'm going to do a quick introduction. I'll introduce our guests, and then we'll get into it. And for those of you that are watching via YouTube, if you want to jump over to LinkedIn, we're going to watch the comment section there. So if anyone has any questions, you can throw it in there. We'll integrate those as we go here. Let me introduce things. So today's panel discussion, we're going to explore the importance of process design. We're going to talk about SOPs, standard operating procedures, their ability to really drive efficiency, consistency, scalability for high growth companies. We're going to talk about how to design processes and SOPs and how they can streamline operations, hopefully reduce some errors, enhance employee productivity. We'll talk about some best practices for how to review and update these and make sure they're aligned with the company goals and growth objectives and where they are. And we're going to talk a little bit about how these can really be the foundation for your growth and long-term sustainable success. So with all that, let me introduce our guests. First up, we've got Wendy Lieber. She is co-founder and CEO of Content Bacon. They're a leading content marketing company. They've got many years of experience. She has worked with lots of different companies to really drive customer engagement through strategic content. She's also a top voice in digital marketing and passionate about storytelling that drives business growth. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Our next guest, Anthony Greco, he is founder of Cassie Partners, is a boutique consultancy dedicated to helping startups navigate key business challenges. Lots of experience in M&A, business development, strategic leadership. Anthony's insights are invaluable to emerging companies looking to scale quickly. Welcome, Anthony.
Thanks, Bruce. Great to be here.
And finally, I am Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm a strategic leadership coach focused on helping CEOs scale and exit businesses faster and hopefully with a little less drama. My experience as a founder and CEO myself, and having worked with many companies on this process, really make sure that we've got practical strategies, achieve sustainable long-term success. So with all that and our topics, let's kind of get into it. I guess for both of you, what's your sort of approach to process design? Like when you're working with a company on, whether it's operations or marketing or sales, like how do you think about process and kind of balance kind of too much process, too little process? Like what's kind of your rules of thumbs around that? Let's start with Wendy and then we'll go to Anthony.
Yeah. So, being in the creative field, content creation, it's kind of interesting that I love process so much, but the reason that I do is because to me, it equates to freedom. The more process and structure I have in place, the more, freedom that I can create and the more scalability. So that's how I think of it. I'm always thinking of how can we replicate this? How can we scale this so that as more and more people might need to do it, are doing it, the quality doesn't get diminished at all. So that's kind of like an overriding way I like to think. Sometimes earlier on, you're figuring out the process, but eventually or very quickly, you've got to get to a point where you can replicate it. Otherwise, I feel like you just set everyone up for failure and mistakes, and that's not really fun.
Yeah. Anthony, your take on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, it's interesting because there's the old sort of saying, kind of start with the end in mind. And I think, when you're setting these things up, it's kind of just like company growth stuff. You really have to start with where you want to be. Where do you want to be? And, the separate and apart from sort of the business growth, from the process side, it's like, what is the end result? Where do we want to go? And then what are the things that are important to drive there? And those become your North Stars. And then when you're establishing those processes, procedures in whatever realm, I come at this from the kind of legal side, the transactional side, getting things done, permitting fast decision-making. You sort of allow these procedures, or the procedures end up getting set up with that end in mind, with those North Stars. And so you kind of have to set these things up knowing, is this getting us closer to our goal or further from the goal? Mm-hmm. And then all with this sort of goal of speed. And, there's also an old saying, kind of slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Mm-hmm. So it's this idea of just like, let's slow everything down. Let's kind of look at this. What do we need to do? How do we need to do it? How do we replicate this? How can we sort of delegate decision making? And with all of that, and there's a lot that goes into it and it takes time, but then once that's done, the goal is that it's never frictionless. The goal is that it's as frictionless as possible. So really kind of bringing it back to that end in mind and the North Star to make those decisions.
Yeah. 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 I'm going to steal Wendy's a little bit. And I hate doing process work. Like I absolutely hate it, but I love what it does for me. Right. Like it's like just the freedom, just like once you get a process figured out and it starts working on its own and it becomes easy, right? Like it starts producing predictable results, like quality starts going up, like all these things are great outcomes. It's just, it can be particularly like for early stage companies and entrepreneurs who are often not very process oriented, it can be pulling teeth, right? Like they just hate it in terms of it. So my next question is really, how do you identify which processes you should really put SOPs against or kind of define in great detail, and which ones you are like, like we can just wing these things? Like, how do you choose where to focus your time and energy? And I'll let either of you kind of chime in on that one.
Yeah, I can jump in. I guess which ones are going to have the greatest impact? Maybe it's, what things are you doing over and over again, where by not having a process, it creates a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of headaches, where if you just took that time, and I love that saying, slow is steady.
Smooth, slow is smooth.
Slow,
Yeah.
smooth, yeah.
Slow is smooth, yeah. My second in command says that to me all the time. And if you can take the time to do that heavy lifting once, then you create just so much more flow and speed. So I think if you can identify like what are the things that just are constantly causing headaches, or constantly causing us to not hit the deadline, not get to the end result, and could a process really solve this? And usually the answer is yes. Usually when we encounter bottlenecks, it's a process issue or it's a people issue, and we always defer to process as the first place to look.
Yeah.
Anthony?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think it's sort of highest value. It's always sort of highest value stuff, but I tend to think these things almost present themselves, because you end up seeing the bottleneck and you realize why have I received the same question, or why has somebody received the same question, 3 times in the past month? Can we just, pre-agree what that is so that everybody knows? And it lends itself to that documentation and the process. And I tend to think, it depends on stage, like super, super early before product market fit, like when you're really trying to figure that stuff out, process becomes harder because you have to do things that don't scale. Like it just is a little harder. When you're in that sort of high growth, high scale stuff, I find that it tends to present itself. And then once you sort of realize where those bottlenecks are, you can come in and sort of, lay out the decisions and whatnot. But I tend to think it's highest value, and it's like the repetitive stuff. It's almost like, it's the annoying stuff that people are like, why are we still talking about this? It's like, well, there's a process.
probably indicator that it needs to have a process behind it. Yeah. The things I find, I agree with both of you. The thing I would add is I usually find that there's like 8 to 12 like key processes inside of a business that really drive value, and making sure that you've got a handle on those can be really, really important. The other one is anything that crosses kind of functional domain or ownership. It's just where we typically see balls being dropped, right? Where it's like, oh, well, I got my part done and it's been sitting in their email, or it's been sitting in the folder, or and the next person didn't pick it up. Like I find those, like having a good process design and structure and, kind of the triggers and kind of accountability around it can be really important. Any techniques that you have for actually developing the processes? Like, how do you go from, okay, yeah, I need to have an SOP, I need to have a process definition around this. How do you actually do it? Is there any kind of approaches or tips or tricks that you use inside organizations?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this,
Yeah.
Bruce. So I'll sort of, to touch on one of your examples, which was really good. Think of, cross-functional things that become sort of, it feels like there's a wrench in the system. I tend to find the first thing is that somebody needs to own it. Yeah. Somebody needs to own it. And it's, if it's more than one, it tends to feel like it gets dropped. So I find that, the biggest thing is when there's one owner, whose job first it is to find out the current process everywhere. Like how do we go from A to Z today? Walk me through it as if I'm an employee getting onboarded, or as if I'm a client getting onboarded, or as if I'm getting billed. Walk me through it from the experience that's important. So is it a customer experience? Is it an employee experience? Like walk me through the whole thing today. And then that person would typically, define where it is today, sort of take it forward with recommendations, and then buy-in from each area. I think you mentioned this earlier that, it's very annoying to certain people. So it really requires buy-in from the leaders of the groups. And so I tend to find that one person owning it with buy-in across the board becomes super important, documenting everything. And so, but I just find that the one, I hate to use the phrase, but it's true. It's like the one neck to choke, like one person who's like, I'm going to own this. I'm going to make sure it's there. I'm going to make sure it works. And we're going to make sure it improves as we go forward, which I know we're going to get into later.
Yeah. Wendy, thoughts on this one?
Yeah, just a couple of things to add on. One, try to keep it to one page. So, create like a one-page process. We have a time-saving, how to get unstuck method, Pomodoro something, you set your timer for 20 minutes and just kind of get something down and then, pass it on to someone else to say, okay, if you had to do this, does this work? And what is this missing? The other thing is if you don't have a process in place and you're guiding someone through something, have them create the process, so if it doesn't exist, and as you're maybe coaching and training someone, it's like, okay, you're responsible. And then, it's got to go through the checks and balances. But those are two ways that, we've learned to kind of jumpstart things. So it doesn't feel like this overwhelming, daunting task. It's just like get started with something, and then you can always tweak, build on, revise.
Yeah.
If I could add one thing on to the one page that's actually super interesting, is like the more graphics and cartoons you can use, the easier. It's kind of funny, but people don't like to read a lot of words, and the more, and not everything can be graphic, but the more graphics there are, it's like an arrow goes from this department to this department. Like there is that, people tend to remember that. So that does work.
Yeah. Yeah. I find one of the best techniques I kind of learned over the years was, I'm going to say that sort of the dumbest person or the most ignorant person in the room should write the process. Because if the person who knows the process really, really well writes the process, they leave out all sorts of stuff they don't realize, right? Because they've internalized so much of how they do things. And then someone else picks it up and they're like, I have no clue how to do this because there's so many missing pieces here. Whereas if you take the person that knows nothing about this and they have to write, they're like, okay, well, wait, where's that folder? What application do I need to download? Like where do I find this thing? And it really helps catch all those things that someone who really knows it well just doesn't even think about.
I would say too, with like screen capture and video sources where you can actually, like, to your point, Anthony, like, show someone like the process and then use that, plug it into AI to, to break it down. Like there's now, it seems like so many tools that make it easier to at least get that first draft. It doesn't mean that's the final draft, but like our team loves, using Loom videos and, capturing things, and it is really helpful.
Yeah. I do a lot of, for my work, particularly with my VA, I'll do a Loom video of whatever it is I'm trying to kind of process, make a process around. And I'll try to, the other trick there is I try to talk a lot, right? Like, okay, so this is what I'm trying to do. And this is why I'm doing this thing. And I'm selecting this one because we don't do that later. Like, 'cause I try to verbalize what I'm doing, but then I have, he or she write the actual script or the actual document. And it's fascinating to go through and like to create a video and then see what they come up with. And they catch all these little things that, oh yeah, I didn't even realize I did that. Or I, switched this over, or I, hit this toggle or something, and they kind of catch the things and then I can edit. So, making the other reason too, is like they own it, right? Like if they've written the document, now it's their document. It's not me sending them the document that they've got to follow. It's they've created the document. And now if they're not following, it's really kind of on them. So that whole ownership thing becomes interesting too.
You make a good point too about not getting so sucked into the process itself, but like, if you're talking through it, almost like, well, why are we doing this? Like, why does this matter? And I think if people understand the why, then they're commitment to, executing it can be, much greater than if it's just like another process to do. But it's like, where does it fit into the big picture, and how does, my respective role, support this? So I think that's really like an important component to not get too caught up in processes, but like, well, why?
Yeah. Yeah. How anything that you've seen in terms of best practices for what to actually include in processes and maybe what not to include? Any kind of things that you've learned or heuristics that you have around that?
I would say, I mean, I think, for me, I'm a big believer in who's responsible for a decision. And in all of these processes, there tends to be a process, but there tends to be a decision maker. And I think the one thing I've seen is when a decision is by a department or by a group or by an area, there is no real decision.
Yeah.
And so I tend to feel like individual names and sometimes it's specific title because places are big, but
Yeah.
individual names are specific titles. So when it goes from one to another, if there's an exception requirement or something, it tends to require that that decision maker. That tends to be a sort of a key trigger. Because if not, I think going back to the point earlier, like the why behind all of this becomes super, super, super important, and it allows people to sort of understand, not only why are we doing this, but why are we making an exception when the process says this? And typically there's a human who can use that judgment, and that I think tends to become pretty important in the whole system.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would concur. I almost think it goes back to like the why, like including that so people understand, and then maybe they have a better idea. Maybe as they're, either reviewing, implementing it, they might be like, why do we do it like this? And it gives them the ability to enhance it, or at least understand why it's so important to do and not deviate, because if you deviate, these things could happen. And if you don't understand that, maybe you do the process 95% complete and you think that's good enough. So I guess I go back to that seems to be one of the most important things to include. And then I guess like the accountability piece, right? Like how do you ensure, it is getting done, so that, again, I think people tend to comply more when they know that someone might be looking over their shoulder. So like adding that piece in so that, they know like, hey, there's accountability.
Yeah.
And I think, I find what's interesting about it is, if you think what's happening here, it's like there's the point of all of this is to allow for like fast decision making across the board so that we can scale faster. And if we all scale faster, we all do better, the company does better. So there is this it's not process for process sake, which I think people hate.
Yeah.
It's just, it actually allows for one, I think it provides autonomy and responsibility and faith and trust in people to say, hey guys, we're setting up these guardrails so that you can go fast. You can go and you can feel this. And then at the same time, like it's important that we follow these, and this is why. It's important we follow these because if we don't do this, the person doesn't get billed in time. Therefore, we don't get paid in time.
Yeah.
It's like tying those things together. And sometimes the person in product doesn't know that, this report is important so that we can get paid in time. So it's tying all that together, which again, I think is pretty hard. But once it's all broken down in as simple as form as possible, which is hard, it becomes, I think people gather it better that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I had two thoughts. One is, I try to, certainly in kind of earlier stage companies where things are moving and things are going to, change reasonably quickly. My kind of heuristic is 80%. Like I want the process to cover 80% of the cases. And if there's always going to be some exceptions, right? Like if we try to make the process try to cover 95%, like this process becomes this horrible, like tree diagram of exceptions and if then statements and stuff. So a lot of times I'm just like, okay, let's get 80% of it to kind of fit this standard process. And then everything else will kind of handle as exceptions. We're not going to try to fit everything into the process, but if we can do 80%, that's really going to help us is really kind of move the needle on those things. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of improvement of processes. So once you've got a process, how do you make sure it kind of at a minimum sort of stays up to date, or how do you grow it. I'm a big fan of Deming, W. Edwards Deming, coming out of Lean Agile, and he has a great phrase which has stuck me forever: is you can't improve a system that's not defined.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if there's no written definition, or if there's no standard way of doing anything, there's no way to kind of improve it, because we don't have any baseline to be able to say, well, this is what we're doing. What do we want to do different? Because otherwise it's just different every time. How, I guess, what are kind of practices or approaches or techniques that you've used to review processes, update processes, improve processes? Any insights there?
Yeah, I mean, I think periodic reviews is key, and really going through them and talking about what's working, what's not, getting input from your team. I think also, as processes are in place and perhaps where you're seeing, you're still seeing bottlenecks or things that aren't as efficient or effective as possible, kind of going back to the drawing board and reviewing something that perhaps has, it's past its time, and it's like this no longer makes sense. So I think putting those periodic reviews, quarterly, bi-yearly, and really making it an important agenda, and then creating an atmosphere where, again, if anyone's got ideas to improve something, whether it's in weekly meetings or again quarterlies, allowing people to step up to improve things or offer suggestions on improvement, and really acknowledging, rewarding when it's a great idea and gets implemented.
Yeah. Anthony?
I think that's spot on. And I think, what I would say is, tactically, I sort of feel like, to your point, Bruce, it's, these things have to be documented. And to steal Wendy's thought from earlier, there has to be a why. So the documentation and the why is typically like, because we want to, for example, I'll use the billing example, bill people by this day every month. So there can be the check, the improvement is, have we hit that goal? Have we hit that metric? So there's something that we're measuring against. And I think, so it's effectively, the review starts with whatever's been documented against the why and against some sort of metric that we all agree is important. And I think what's super important, and Wendy, you said this, is, I think the sort of open feedback from everybody becomes super important. And I find that it has to come from the people on the ground doing it, not their bosses. So it's the people that are actually responsible for doing this, typically are like, this is so dumb. Why do we do these 3 steps when it can be 1 step? And you never know that if it has to go through 3 levels. So it's a little bit like the people that are actually hands-on doing it. If you have it there, and everybody takes a no pride in authorship mentality of, we're just looking for better ideas, we just want this to get better, we don't have to change it if it's working. Don't feel like we have to, but let's see, did we hit our goal? Seems to be working well. Can we make it faster? Can we make anybody's life easier? And then just, I think through that rubric is important, but to, again, it has to be measured against, to your point, Bruce, like, it has to be documented. There has to be something that we're looking at to say, did we hit this or not? Mm-hmm. And if there is no why, there is no metric, it starts to feel like, does this process even matter? Yeah. Which actually does call out. I mean, that'll become apparent.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the, it's coming out of Lean Agile. We would do retrospectives at every iteration and stuff. So there was this kind of muscle that we built in terms of constantly reviewing results and process, where can we make improvement? And one of the best techniques that I remember coming up with, or that one of the teams was doing, is they would take the process documents, and as they were working on it, they would leave little notes in the process document saying, oh, maybe we should rethink this, or we had a problem here, or this didn't work this time. So that every week we would literally just go through the comments that were made and start making decisions like, okay, should we change this? Should we update this? Or like, why did this go wrong? Let's dig into a root cause analysis, right? That would be, and then you'd clean up the notes. So there was this constant kind of layer, the filter or like lens that was going on in the process document, where we would capture these things, because oftentimes you would forget about it, right? Like, you were in the throes of executing on the process and something go wrong. You're like, I just got to keep going, and you'd forget about it. Well, if you could make little notes on it, then it would prompt you to be at the end of the week or the end of 2 weeks. You'd be like, oh yeah, that's right, we had that case. I wonder what really happened there. We should dig into that.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that, Bruce, before we jump. Just add on to that. It's a little bit of like the post whatever and it's different for different businesses, but it's post whatever the quote unquote mission is. It's like what worked, what didn't, how do we get better? And I think, to your point, Bruce, it's that real time becomes important. It's a really good point, because if if people go on 3 months, then they sort of almost feel like an obligation to be critical or an obligation to try to improve it, when it's at that point you've lost the real substance.
Yeah.
So the real time stuff is important. That's a good point.
In the moment. I always find that in this kind of process improvement, we have a process, we're trying to figure out how to improve it. There's sort of this incremental approach, which is, oh, we can, 1% better here, 1% better there. Like we can do this. And then at some point there's kind of like, we got to throw this out. We got to start over because there's like enough has changed where we got to just fundamentally rethink how we're doing this thing. I guess, how do you balance, or what are indicators for you when a process is like, just like incrementally changing a process is probably like, it's time for a complete rethink on something? Is there anything that you see, or situation or energy, anything in terms of a team, or that would indicate that maybe you need to do a wholesale rethink?
Well, I think Anthony touched on it. I think outcomes, right? It's like if you know what the end game is and you're measuring outcomes and you're not getting where you want to go, that's, where perhaps either processes aren't being followed or it's time for an overhaul. So that's, to me, it's, because if things are going great, you could still have, shitty processes, but who cares? Things are going great.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's, so I think if you're really, you've got good outcomes set up and good, leading indicators, lagging indicators, whatever terminology you want to use. And when things aren't hitting the mark that you've defined well, then, it's time to look a layer deeper and see where the issue is.
Yeah. I would put these into kind of two buckets. So one, there's like the internal only corporate processes where, the two most important sort of aspects of the org, your employees, your people, and the customers. If there's something internal, pure corporate, that just sort of back office, I tend to find that the iterative stuff can be worked through there. The wholesale, to me, tends to feel more, and I think you see it more when there's a true problem with like an employee or a customer. So for example, think about customer experience. Yeah. We all think the customer experience is one way. And then, and I would challenge folks. If anybody's got a SaaS product, go on, try to go through your onboarding as if you were a third party. Like, do it, go in incognito, like go through it and do the process. Yeah. And then you realize you're like, oh, our process results in this outcome. That's not what we want at all. Or employee comes on, you think that they have an amazing experience. They quit 2 months in, you have coffee with them and you're like, what happened? And like, oh, this was horrible. And then you're like, oh my God. So it gives this like rethink. I've not seen a circumstance where there's this like iterative process results in throwing it out, other than in the context of sometimes new people come in and they just kind of want to shake it up. Yeah. But you do think about it more and see it more in the context of like bad human experience. And you start to realize like, oh no, this isn't an iterative thing. We have to rethink why we're doing this, go back to the why, go back to the how. So those two become important. Yeah.
I just have this vision or reminder of this show where the CEO goes in incognito and becomes an employee and they realize all the horrible things that are going on in their company. It's easy just to be blind to all that stuff until you actually go in and try to do it like a customer or like an employee.
Yeah. With an open mind, and it's hard sometimes. Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's really hard. Kind of my last question here is if folks are listening to this, if I'm a leader inside of a company or a department and I'm trying to figure this out, like what are some things that they can do to kind of balance this? Okay, yeah, I need to create processes, but I also need to create flexibility and I want to drive innovation. Like what are some suggestions you would have in terms of things they should think about or things they should ask themselves to kind of figure out that balance and maybe where they need to spend some time and focus? Any insights there?
I think, I'll jump in. I think it goes back to Wendy's point initially, and Wendy, sorry if I'm stealing this from you as your answer. I think it's the highest value stuff and starting with the why. So I think it's like when you come back to that, you think about the highest value stuff, starting with the why, document that and just keep an open mind that the point is not to be a slave to the process. The point is to drive the why forward. And so I think if you just keep that in mind and some people they're sticklers, they need to stick to it. And it's sometimes you're just like, if this is not hitting the why, we have to move on.
Right. Wendy?
Yeah, I would just say, I don't think trying to create flexibility is going to work if you don't have a process in which to start with, right? So I would err on the side to create the process, create the guardrails, and then use that as a barometer. Is this working to get us closer or not, versus going in with the mindset, we want to be innovative, we want to be, flexible. It's like good processes will help you create being able to be flexible and innovative, because you know where the baselines are and you've got things in place, versus trying to do it the other way. And I say that from experience because I'm always the one like wanting to come in with something new, something different. And luckily, I've got a good team who's been sticklers on processes. And so it allows so much more of that. Whereas otherwise you just drive people crazy and no one can be successful in their position. And that was really maybe the turning point for me early on, when we started Content Bacon, was I wanted my team to feel good about the results they could provide. And that wasn't going to happen if I did things my entrepreneurial way, because that works for me, but then they don't know how to be successful because it's changing every day. And so that's when like the proverbial, switch flipped for me was, if I do this, then I'm setting them up for success. And ultimately that's what's most important to me as a leader, is I want my team to be successful, because if they're successful, then our customers are successful, and then I'm successful. So all comes back to me, but through them.
Yeah, I would agree. My comment was going to be, I always start with know thyself first, right? And just kind of know your tendencies. And if you know you're a person who, I love to just mix things up, I'm always coming up with new ideas, you probably need to be leaning towards all right, I need to put a little more process in place. And the flip side is true. Like if I'm, I run into this with technologists all the time, where it's like they're so process oriented and they want to document everything. And I'm just like, okay, you got to loosen it up a little bit, because we're going to have to move a little more quickly, and we're going to have to be able to change this. And if we're, if this is a 37-page document about how to send an email, like we're not going to get many emails out right now. Good. Thank you so much. We're going to hit time here. For people that want to get more information about folks, Wendy, what's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, I'm easy to find. Wendy at Content Bacon. I'm all over LinkedIn, all the social. So reach out. I'm happy to always chat about anything and everything.
Awesome. Thank you. Anthony?
Yeah, same. So LinkedIn is easy. And then the website is www.cassiepartners, CASSI partners.com. And I'm just Anthony at cassiepartners.com. So easy to find as well.
Awesome. And if you want to get into contact with me, it's just Bruce at eckfeldt.com. Pretty straightforward, my name. Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you so much, Wendy. Thanks for being here today. Thank you for everyone joining us. It was an absolute pleasure. There's going to be a recording of this, and the information will be on the show notes and stuff. So thank you again for being part of the program today.
Thanks, Bruce.